Welcome back to our Bible study on Acts chapter 9. My apologies that it's been quite a while since the last instalment, but we're here now, we're back, and we're ready to get on with Acts. Just a little bit of a reminder of what happened in chapter 8. So after Stephen's stoning, we read that Saul was going house to house looking for and persecuting the Christians. The disciples were starting to disperse and take the gospel message beyond Jerusalem and beyond the Jews. And that's where we pick up the story in chapter 9. Now, in order to help us to understand this chapter, I want us to look at the 5 key characters who are in this chapter. They are Saul, and obviously that's going to be a longer section because there's quite a bit of information about Saul at this stage. But we also have Ananias, Barnabas, Peter, and then I'm going to do a final section shared between Aeneas and Tabitha. So let's see what we can learn from each of these. We're going to start with Saul himself. Now, all we know about Saul at this point from the text of Acts is that he was there at Stephen's stoning and he approved of the stoning. And he was persecutor of the Christians and very vehement in his actions. And this chapter starts with the fact that Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He got letters from the high priests to the synagogue in Damascus so that if he found any Christians, any followers of this new way, then he could take them to prison in Jerusalem. Paul knew that some of the Christians had escaped to Damascus, and he wanted to go and stop them. Now, Damascus was quite important at this time. It was an important place. According to my NIV study Bible, Damascus was the next important city outside of Palestine, and it had a large Jewish population. Damascus had large commercial links with a far-flung caravan trade reaching out to North Syria, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Persia and Arabia. So if Christianity started to flourish in Damascus, it was inevitable that the message would spread. The caravan trades meant that people were travelling all the time, and it could spread very rapidly. Therefore, Saul wanted to stop it. He wanted to cut off this Christianity at the source. So off Saul went to Damascus. It was probably about 140-150 mile journey and would take around a week to travel on foot. And on the way to Damascus, Saul had what is probably the best known conversion experience in the whole of the Bible. He saw a flash of light from heaven, he fell to the ground, and Jesus' voice spoke to him. Now Saul thought himself a great Jew who obeyed every law. He was truly passionate about defending God, and especially defending God against the emerging Christian church, which he saw as heretical and a threat. Now Wright says that Paul was a deeply devout Jew who would have used prayer and meditation daily as part of his Jewish tradition, and he studied the scripture as a passion. And as a Pharisee, he would have been taught meditation in order to grow closer to God. Now, Wright suggests that maybe Paul, on his journey to Damascus, was meditating. Saul truly believed that he was on his way to preserve the glory of God. These were crazy followers, these Christians, and maybe he was meditating on that glory when the physical form of that glory came to him. And it was Jesus. His whole faith would have instantly been turned inside out. His earthly eyes saw into the heavenly realm, and what did they see? None other than Jesus himself. This must have confirmed and overturned everything that Saul had ever believed. This God that he was so vehement in protecting was telling him that Jesus was the Messiah, risen from the dead and Lord of the world. You can imagine Saul trying to recount all the scriptures that he'd ever learned in his head, trying to work out, could this possibly be true? Could he really be seeing what he was seeing? And so when Saul fell to the ground, it was probably in guilt and in shame and in the sudden realisation that he'd actually been persecuting God all this time, the God who he loved. Wright suggests that Saul's experience was more like a volcanic eruption, a thunderstorm and a tidal wave all in one, rather than just a simple conversion. So much so that it took Saul 3 days to recover from the shock and the guilt and the shame. Imagine there was something that you were vehement about protecting, that you wanted to defend it and would do anything to defend that thing. And then imagine the sudden realisation that by your actions you are actually destroying that very thing. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Those words of Jesus must have really haunted Saul. And as he lay on the floor, in guilt and in shame and in realisation, he was told to get up and to go into the city, but he'd been blinded, so he had to be led by the hand. And Barclay points out the irony here that Saul's intention was to go into Damascus like an avenging fury, and instead he was led by the hand, blind and helpless. Now we're going to come to Saul's encounter with Ananias later on, but let's just stay with Saul for another moment or two. We know that he spent several days with the disciples in Damascus, and at once he started to preach in the synagogues, astonishing all who heard and growing more and more powerful. Saul would have been well known by reputation by these people in the synagogues. This was not an easy place to start his ministry. There was probably 100 better places or easier places that Saul could have started his preaching. But no, this is where Saul felt called to spread his newfound faith and knowledge and experience. Now the people were astonished because they knew who this was. They knew that this was the persecutor and that he baffled the Jews by proving that Jesus was the Messiah. Saul was the ideal preacher of the gospel when you think about it. Someone who was born in a Greek city with Roman citizenship, raised as a Jew, was ideally qualified to take this good news to the Gentiles and others. He knew all the arguments and counter-arguments of the Jewish faith. He knew the scriptures to prove his points, and he knew the teachings and the holes in those teachings. Who better to take God's message to the Jews and to the Gentiles than the one who had denied it and defended the law vehemently to all costs? And Saul knew that this wasn't going to be an easy life. He too was going to suffer, just as all the other Christians did. Saul went to Damascus, intending to stop the spread of Christianity by cutting it off at the source. But instead, he ensured that he preached there, and in doing so, he lit the blue touch paper for Christianity to spread. Now we read that Saul stayed in Damascus, and after many days there was a plot to kill him, and that many days is believed to have been about 3 years. But he probably didn't stay in Damascus this whole time. Barclay suggests that Saul travelled to Arabia in this time, and that is also mentioned in Galatians. But Saul probably needed that time out to assimilate to his new life and to seek guidance and strength, a little like Jesus when he went into the wilderness at the beginning of his ministry. This was such a huge, dramatic change for Saul. His whole existence had been turned upside down, and for him to be effective, he needed that time with God to work out the way forward for him. Well, after a while, the Jews conspired to kill Saul, and he found out about it. Saul, this brand new Christian, was preaching the gospel and was preaching it in such a way that the Jews couldn't argue against him. They couldn't find an argument that would stand. And so their only option to shut him up was to resort to violence. And as Barclay points out, No one persecutes a man who is ineffective. Counterfeit Christianity is always safe. Real Christianity is always in peril. So as the Jews were guarding the gates, Saul's followers lowered him in a basket through an opening in the wall at night. This was very much still at the start of his ministry, and already he was escaping death by the skin of his teeth. So what can we learn from and through Saul? There's so much in this chapter, but I just wanted us to think about two elements of the story. And the first hit me quite strongly, and that was God's plans. Saul's plan was to go into Damascus all guns blazing and to wreak havoc on the Christians. But instead, he was led by the hand, blind and vulnerable. God thwarted Saul's plans and turns them around. And maybe you can see times in your own life where you've had something planned, you've been determined that this is what you were going to do, this is the route that you were going to travel, and then something's happened. Those plans have been thwarted and never come to be. And sometimes it's only when we look back later in life that we realise that the change plan was all for the best. God's plan was well prepared. The setting was important. This had to take place in Damascus. Damascus was the ideal place for this to happen, for the spread of Christianity to be initiated. This is where God chose. And just as Saul wanted to use his knowledge of this place for bad to stop God, then so God wanted to use the knowledge of this place for good. And good always wins. The set place was planned, the person was planned. I believe that God had been preparing Saul for this role for the whole of his life. Saul's learning, his instruction, his knowledge, his passion for God. Saul was ideal by his background. God had been working through him, preparing him for this moment the whole of his life. And I've often looked back at my own life and saw indications of becoming a minister, even long before I'd even thought about it, possibly longer than I even knew what a minister was. I also see times where I think somebody was trying to stop those plans, trying to throw me off course. But God's plans will out if we trust in him. God gave Saul the gifts that he needed to fulfill this role, not least the amazing preaching ability. Saul certainly had never preached the gospel before, and yet this encounter with God led to the possibility of such amazing things. He didn't start off his preaching easy and build up. Saul started in the most difficult place that he could have done, and he was so effective that those who heard him wanted to kill him. God had this all in his plan from the beginning. Maybe it's reassuring to hear God's words from Psalm 139, that all the days allotted to us are written in God's book. He knows them all, and he follows us and watches us through them all. Or God's words to Jeremiah, for I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. God has plans for his world, his church, and for us, and anything is possible as long as we trust in him. So that's one thing that struck me in this chapter, was God's plan and his intricate details of that plan. The second point I want us to think about is the fact that anything is possible through God. God's power and transformational ability are amazing. To stop Saul, the persecutor, in his tracks, and not just to stop him, but to turn him around and become one of the founders of our faith, is beyond words. To turn the people of Damascus from fearers to believers and those who would spread the gospel is amazing. Meeting Jesus changes people in dramatic ways. We can have that change. We can know that change in our own lives, no matter what we've done in the past. Saul realised what he had done, and he fell to the floor, and for 3 days he mourned what he had done. But God forgave him. he turned around and God used him in such a magnificent way. So for our reflection on Saul, what are God's plans for you? What has he been working in you, maybe for some time? Where is he leading you right now? The timing is his, the place is his, the people are his. But do we trust God enough to say, your will, not mine, be done? And have you had an encounter with Jesus that has changed you? God's possibilities for us are endless. What do we need to turn away from? Where have we been letting God down or persecuting him and hurting him? Saul, what a remarkable story. Now Saul wouldn't have got where he got if it hadn't been for Ananias. So we're going to spend a few moments thinking about Ananias. Now God called to Ananias in a vision and told him to go to Saul, who would be expecting him to come and restore his sight. Ananias objected, as I think most of us would. The Christians in Damascus, including Ananias, must have known that Saul was on his way, and they would have been terrified. Ananias knew what Saul had done to the Christians, and he wasn't too keen on the idea of going to meet him. But God told Ananias to go, because Saul was his chosen instrument to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. So Ananias went and did as he was told. Ananias is definitely one of life's unsung heroes. We know nothing of him before this story, and we know nothing of him after this story. All we know is from this chapter. So what impression can we form of Ananias, and what can we learn from him? Well, he was certainly a man who was in communion with God, and he knew how to listen to God. His instructions were clear. He understood God's message straight away. We don't read of days and days thinking, is this really what God wanted me to do? He might not have been immediately willing to follow, but he heard those instructions. He was also not afraid to question God. He obviously had a good enough relationship with God to be able to say to him, hang on a minute, are you sure you want me to go to this man? Do you really know who you're sending me to? But Ananias was also wise enough not to push it with God. When he was clearly told to go, he went. And he trusted. He trusted God to go off to the dangerous. He did it with love, with grace, and in wisdom. Ananias didn't go in there to Saul's with 3 bodyguards, all hesitant just in case God had actually got it wrong. He went in and gently placed his hands upon Saul and called him brother. There was welcome and trust in his actions and his greeting. Saul was now part of the church family, those who knew Jesus Christ. He was to be treated as such, and Ananias had the faith and trust to do just that. Christian love is all about God's power and strength to change people, and Christian communities which follow God's will are places where that transformation can and should be happening. Ananias did his very important bit. What would have happened if he hadn't? What would have happened if Ananias refused to go? Where would the early Christian church have been without Paul? Now, Ananias will obviously have had a big influence on Saul, especially his forgiveness, his grace, and his welcome towards him. And Ananias' story is not half as well known as Saul's, and yet where would Saul have been without him? We may not be able to change the world. Maybe we feel like we've passed our influential days or missed the boat. We might not have the energy or the possibilities or the opportunity to go and do as much as we would like to or once may have done. But maybe we can influence someone else who can go and do. Someone who can do it a whole lot more effectively than we could. I often wonder Who were the people who encouraged folk like Justin Welby when he was a young Christian? Who prayed for our current Pope as a child and encouraged him in his faith? We will all have had those people when we look back over our lives who've encouraged us in faith. And maybe even they were not aware of the influence that they had, but we know, and it was important to us. Encouragement is a gift from God, as is the trust that Ananias had and his ability to listen to God. So where can we encourage others in their faith? Do we need to learn to listen better? And do we need to trust more? The third character I want us to look at is Barnabas. Now Saul tried to join the disciples in Jerusalem, but they were scared of him and they didn't know if they could trust him or not. I don't think they really believed him at first. But Barnabas took Saul to the apostles and he told them about his conversion and his preaching in Damascus. I wonder if Barnabas was another influential person to Saul in his faith development. Barnabas's charity, his trust, his belief that Saul had really changed and that he was now a huge force for good. Everyone else was staying clear. Only Barnabas stood up for Saul, living out the gospel of second chances. Are you the type of person who always sees the best in someone? Are you the type of person who usually sees the flaws? Jesus always saw the best in others, as did Barnabas. He saw Saul's potential. And because of Barnabas's faith in him and vouching for him, Saul was then able to stay with the apostles and spoke boldly around Jerusalem in Jesus' name. He talked and debated with the Hellenistic Jews, but these Jews were equally as unimpressed as the other Jews with Saul's change of heart, and they also tried to kill him. So the disciples took him to Caesarea and sent Saul off back home to Tarsus. Saul was always going to be persecuted, and so the disciples sent him back home to his own people. Now the church in Judea, in Galilee and Samaria then enjoyed a time of peace. The church was strengthened by the Holy Spirit and grew in numbers. It's quite ironic that once Saul left, there was then peace in the church. And we could look at that as a negative thing against Saul, that he brought unrest wherever he went. But maybe it showed that amongst the Christians there was a new energy after hearing Saul. And all of this was only possible because of the faith and trust of Barnabas. The courage in taking Saul to the other disciples, the risk he took in backing Saul. We don't know whether God told Barnabas to do this or whether it was just in his nature, but he was certainly fulfilling God's plan as much as Ananias or Saul himself. So my questions regarding Barnabas is, how much faith do we have in others? Do we look for the negative, the splinter in our brother's eye? Or do we look for the positive and the potential? Can we see good and potential in people? And are we willing to make personal sacrifices in order for them to flourish? The things we can learn from Barnabas. There's quite a shift now in the story as we go away from the drama and the flashing lights and the death threats of Saul's story, and we go back to Peter and an incident that happened in a quiet home. Peter was travelling around the country and he went to visit the Lord's people at Lydda. Here he healed Aeneas, and then he was sent for to go to Joppa, about 12 miles away, and here he healed Tabitha. Now we'll come to Aeneas and Tabitha in a minute, but let's just focus on Peter. Peter was getting on with what needed to be done. He was off out at this point, not preaching or converting, but encouraging those who were already disciples. It's not as dramatic as conversion work, but it was equally as important. This would have now been a major part of the apostles' work. We have to remember that with so many new Christians, there wasn't a manual for how to be a Christian church. There wasn't a self-help book for these Christians. They were having to learn and develop as they went on. The apostles couldn't just introduce people to Christ and leave them to get on with it by themselves. They needed to go back and encourage and help these people. These new Christians would have possibly had access to the scrolls of the Old Testament, and they would have had Jesus' teaching, which was passed down to them by word of mouth. But that would have been all, and they would be trying to interpret these teachings the best that they could in the situation that they were in. So they needed that support from the apostles. Now, while Peter was in the vicinity, he was sent for by the church in Joppa. Maybe he was sent to console with them, for they'd lost an important and special member of their community. Or maybe they expected a miracle. The Christians in Joppa would obviously have heard about Peter's healing ministry. They would have heard stories from Jerusalem, maybe even the story from Lydda. But as of yet, God had not raised anyone from the dead through Peter. So maybe it was for consolation that they called him. Or maybe they wanted to be part of a miracle too. Maybe there's part of us that wants to be part of the miraculous, want to be part of the spectacular. And whether intentionally or not, Peter was very careful to follow Jesus' example. He sent the widows out of the room so that he could be alone with the person that needed healing. And that's very reminiscent of when Jesus was called to Jairus' house when Jairus' daughter died, and he sent everybody out so he could be alone with the girl. And when Peter was alone, he got down on his knees and he prayed. Peter knew his place. He was a channel of God's power and work. He did not claim to own that power himself. If we try and do things in our own power, we will fail. But if we are a channel for God's power, then the possibilities are endless. As Barclay said, we think too much of what we can do and too little of what Christ can do through us. There's a lot to be learned from Peter here, and his humble ministry at this time of caring and supporting others rather than the dramatic ministry of conversion. He would have done both in his time, but this was the time for caring and for helping and for developing people's faith. And yet, as a channel of God's power, he was able to do the miraculous, heal a man and raise a woman from the dead. What is our ministry? Is it a dramatic upfront ministry? Or is it in the background, a humble serving ministry? Whichever God calls us to at this time in our lives, do we try and do it in our own strength? Or do we allow God to use us as a channel? God's mission for today is still the same, to bring his people home, to teach people his way, and for us to bring about his kingdom on earth. It's not about what we can do. It's about what God can do through us. So the last two people I want us to consider, we're going to look at them together, is Aeneas and Tabitha, or Dorcas. And I'm going to call her Tabitha today. Well, Aeneas was in Lydda, and the church members at Lydda were called by Luke the Lord's people, or the saints, depending on which version of the Bible that you use. And the saints was a common word used by Paul later in his letters for God's people. We read that he wrote the letter to the saints in Ephesus or to the saints in Philippi. And the saints were the people who were set apart to do God's work. Now, according to Barclay, the word used here is hagios, and the root meaning of that word is different. Christians are different from the people of the world, Hagios was specifically used in the past for the people of Israel. They were the holy and special ones, the chosen people of God. But when Israel failed in following God and rebelled and turned away from Jesus, their Messiah, then the Christian church became the chosen ones, the true Israel. And Christianity became the different ones. Different because they were chosen for a special purpose by God. Not different because they were chosen for greater honour, but different because they were chosen for greater service. Aeneas was probably one of those saints in Lydda, as Peter was visiting the believers. Aeneas was paralysed. He had been bedridden for 8 years when Peter went to see him, and Peter told him to get up, and he did, and immediately he was healed. Now we have slightly more detail about Tabitha's story. She was a good lady, always doing good and helping the poor. She had died and was in an upstairs room surrounded by grieving widows who were showing Peter what lovely robes and clothing Tabitha had made in her lifetime. Peter prayed and told her to get up. She opened her eyes and saw Peter and sat up. He helped her to her feet and then called the others and presented Tabitha before them. Now, one of the questions raised is, why were these two specifically healed? There must have been many people in Lydda and in Joppa who were ill at this time. Why these two? Maybe because Aeneas and Tabitha represent so many other faithful servants, serving God in their own quiet way. Wright says that Luke draws our attention from the spectacular of Saul's conversion to the everyday, for these were the people who made up the church and still do. They form the heart of our church today. While the apostles and evangelists go about making important decisions, getting locked up and stoned and shipwrecked, the widows were beginning to form an important group within the life of the church. They were starting to be recognised and acknowledged as having a significant contribution to make. And Wright goes on to say, do not belittle the ministry of stitching, sewing or knitting. Aeneas and Dorcas ground us. They're ordinary people who are precious to God and who are used by God to fulfil his purpose throughout history. Even small stories are important in the kingdom of God, as they show that the power of God is at work in ordinary people's lives. No wonder that word got around and many believed. We may not be Peters or Sauls, but we can all be Aeneas's and Tabitha's, serving God faithfully in our place. And stories like these show God's love for those people and how much he valued them. And that through their influence and experience, God's word and his love spread. Well, I've shared the questions as I've gone along today, but I leave you with a reminder of the key points of each character. So firstly, Saul. God had an amazing plan which he had been putting into place over the years, and Saul stepped in to play his part. What is God's plan right now for his church, for his people, for us as individuals? And how is he preparing us for that plan? Where might we need to do a complete U-turn as Saul did in order to get back on his tracks? Like Ananias, where can we encourage others in their faith? And do we need to learn to listen better and learn to trust God more, having the courage to do what he calls us to do? Barnabas, are we prepared to see the best in others and see God at work in their lives too? And are we willing to make personal sacrifices in order for others to flourish? Then Peter. As a channel of God's power, Peter was able to do the miraculous. As a church and as individuals, do we try and do God's work in our own strength? Or do we allow God to use us as a channel? And then lastly, Aeneas and Tabitha. Do we truly value those in our church who work away in the background, serving God faithfully? And how can we be more like Aeneas and Tabitha, witnessing quietly to those around us? So I leave you to ponder what character you feel that you can relate best to today, and which character challenges you for the future. Sorry this has been a bit longer than usual. Maybe I had lots to say after being quiet on this front for the last couple of months, but I want to get back into a regular routine now so we can continue to explore the rest of Acts together. So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to sharing with you next time.